The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Welcome back. Well, Jackie, you're just back from Hawaii. You got a little bit of a tan. You look very relaxed. But I sense you're getting back into the numbers.
Yeah, well, I don't feel very relaxed, but and my holiday feels a long time ago. But yeah, we're always into the numbers. We're always trying to analyze things with numbers.
I know, and oftentimes I look at numbers. Of course, I've been looking at numbers all my career. But you look at them and the charts and the graphs and the tables, they do tell a story. But, quite often I tell my audiences that I present to that, the proverbial picture is worth 1,000 words, and to the more numerical audience, as I say, a picture is worth 1,000 spreadsheets, because really a bar chart doesn't tell what is really happening in the world. And oftentimes I just say, close your laptop, look out the window. When you're driving home, look at what you see around you. When you're on vacation, take a look and see what's going on in the world of energy and do a reality check. And I also tell people, take a photo, take it back, much as I do, take a look at it, and just see what you see. And for us, our lens is energy. See what you think of it as energy. But we're delighted today because...
Today we have someone who's put his life towards taking pictures of industry and energy. And we're very happy today to have Ed Burtynsky, photographer. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jack.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Ed. It's really delightful to be here. And so for our audience to envision where we are, this actually is one of the handful of live recordings that we've done. We are in the offices of GBE Energy, which has graciously offered their space, and is also Corey Paddock, who is the CEO, is an avid collector of Burtynsky photographs. And so for those of you in our listening audience, I just want you to envision a really cool office space in downtown Calgary, sort of a modern vibe with photographs of Edward Burtynsky all around us. And we're going to get to know Ed a little bit better here. And he's going to tell us why he's in town. I think you're from Toronto, right, Ed?
I'm from Toronto, flew in this morning, and I've been represented by Paul Kuhn in Calgary now for probably 15, 20 years. And so Calgary's been always a stop along the way in my exhibitions. And so I've had a long-standing relationship with Calgary and with Edmonton. I had a big show, the Alberta Art Gallery, the oil show, when I did a whole show on oil, and I photographed Alberta several times.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your photographs here in a minute, because you're being already somewhat modest. Your shows are, I think, concurrently going on in Hong Kong and New York. You have exhibits in some of the finest galleries around the world. It's so lovely to see a Canadian of your stature achieve these levels as a photographer, and we're delighted to have you. Now, I know as a listener to a podcast, you as our audience are not able to see where we are or see the photographs, so I encourage you to go to edwardburtynsky.com, whether you're on your phone or maybe you're sitting in front of a computer or your iPad or whatever, and you can kind of follow along or check out the website as we go. But maybe we'll start, Ed, by just tell us how you got to be a photographer.
I fell in love with it as a kid. So when I was... back in the 60s, this was way pre-digital, and all we had was a family camera. And so kids weren't able to take pictures. And it was always like taken out during special events on the Sunday when we're all dressed up, or a special event, a birthday, but that was it. So it's not like today. But at 11, I was lucky where my dad was interested in photography, and he got a dark room. And in that dark room that he got, there were 3 cameras in a box, and he said, "Here's yours." I remember it was like a Minolta A 35, but the magic was that it had these 100-foot rolls of Tri-X film. Those who love photography, it's one of the classic films. And it had cassettes, and I could spool off these cassettes and put them in the camera and shoot whatever I wanted. So if I wanted to take, my first foray into photography was 36 pictures of my dog jumping in the snow. And then I went and processed the film for the first time. And in the magic of a dark orange light in the furnace room in the wintertime, up comes this image of my dog. And to me, it was like magic. And so from that time on, I could just spool off anytime I wanted and take pictures. So I always had a camera with my friends, and they didn't, because again, it was expensive, but I had all the chemicals, I had all the film. So I had this free flowing, and I was just fascinated with the fact that I was in a 3-dimensional world But when I took a whole bunch of pictures, one of them, I usually took many, because that first experience of 36 of my dog, 2 of them were great. The rest of them were mediocre. And I realized all pictures aren't alike, and that the flattening of the 3-dimensional world into this 2-dimensional piece of paper, there was some magic to it. And I was curious about what the world looked like as a picture. And that was my intuitive way of training my eye and taking pictures as a young kid.
Oh, well, now you're a world-renowned photographer from that start of taking pictures of dogs, and you really differentiated yourself by taking these pictures of industry and humans' impact on the planet. So what got you into that? What made that something you wanted to take photos of? Because those are things mostly people want to take photos of things that we like seeing, not things we don't like seeing.
It was interesting because one of the ways, like my father died when I was 15 and I wanted to go to university and college. So my mother really didn't have any funds and resources. So I had to put myself through school. And I was born in St. Catharines, which was an industrial town. It was a GM town. So I got work in large industries. So my first job was in a big frame plant, punching out frames for trucks. Heavy, heavy labor. And then I went to the GM plant. I went to the Ford plant. And then when I was 19, I heard that there was good money to be made in mining. So I went to Red Lake and became a miner for 6 months to earn enough money to buy a camera and go to school in photography. So at a certain point, I realized that there's this whole world of industry that we never get a chance to see. And the camera was this fascinating way to transcribe those worlds that we partake of in every day. So I decided to actually, where they say a writer should write about something that they're familiar with or something that they somehow own or have been part of their biography. Well, this was part of my biography, and I decided that I would train my camera on the worlds that we partake of but never get to see.
Mm-hmm. So mining sort of was the entree industry, and industry is often at conflict with nature, and really that's what you specialize in terms of bringing people's awareness to what's going on behind the scenes. And so let's talk about that, because and if you're on Ed's website, the splash page has the quote, "We come from nature. There is an importance to having a certain reverence for what nature is because we are connected to it. If we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves." Can you sort of expand on how your emotions around what you do as you see conflict between nature and industry?
Well, yeah. When I first started taking pictures of industry, it was kind of out of scale and awe of, and the lack of familiarity that I had and we all have with those worlds, behind those walls where the things that we use every day with the cars or the planes or all those kinds of industries were not known to us. So it was out of this curiosity that I began. But then as I went into mining and when I started seeing deforestation and mining, even large-scale agriculture, I started realizing that the victim here is nature, that as our success continues on and as technology gets more and more sophisticated and more capable of extracting, whether it's forests or trees or minerals, at the other side of that is this diminishing of the natural world. In many ways, that the whole body of work almost stands as a lament for the loss of nature to our success. Like my father, when he was alive, took me into forest when I was 3 years old to go mushroom picking. We went fishing on boats, and we went into the north, and I really explored that, and I was, as a kid, in the forest all the time. So nature was kind of part of my DNA when I grew up. So there had to be this understanding and reverence for, I think, nature, for me to understand it's that something is being lost in our success.
Now, do you think you've got a selection bias because you really focus on the very negative things without the context of those things are part of the landscape, but there's lots of the landscape that it doesn't look like that, and you sort of don't get that context by seeing a kind of a narrow scope of a picture that's pretty ugly in some of these industrial areas? It leads us to think we're in big trouble, but we kind of lose context that, and I don't deny, by the way, that humans are having a bigger and bigger footprint on the world, but kind of we lose that context that isn't just all there is. There's like beautiful parts of the world as well.
Yeah, there is. And I've actually really tried to take these industries and apply a lot of what I learned in university about the history of art and the history of photography. I've taken references from abstract expressionism, even the great modernists and some contemporary photography, There's a group called the New Topographics that came out in the mid-'70s. That was a big influence on my work. I even looked at the original practitioners of photography in the 1850s, Carlton Watkins, and the work they did with these big cameras. So I've kind of taken references from the whole arc of history of art and photography and applied, I think, the kinds of compositions using color on all these different industries and try to find whether it's a refinery, I would go with one kind of look and the way of thinking and an approach, or mines, that would be a whole other approach, or we wanted to do the shipbreaking work. Each one of these was kind of unlocking a puzzle of how to visually capture it in a way that's interesting and intriguing, but also isn't quote unquote ugly. It's that it's something that draws you in, that piques your curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there's a capture when you stand in front of any of your amazing photographs, especially when they're blown up to 4 feet by 5 feet. There's this feeling of being drawn in. And so as you talk to people in galleries that are viewing your works, come to events like this one here, I would suggest that a large fraction of your audience is sort of affluent, more of the elite elements of society. They're the ones that can afford your works. And as they look at your works and experience that capture that you speak of, do they actually connect the dots between, oh yeah, that's really unnerving to see the salt ponds on the other side of the world, or the oil fields, or the mines, or the scars on the planet, to their own behavior? Because at the end of the day, those things are supplied to satisfy the demands of what we value in our modern day world here, especially in the more affluent countries which consume your photographs. So.
Yeah, I think when I'm talking about my work, one of the things that I'm always careful to say is that I don't photograph disasters. I photograph business as usual. So in the world that we live in, this is the yin to the yang. To have a city like this, all these materials, where does the silica from glass come from? Where does the steel from the rebar and the columns and the concrete come from? Everything has a source in the natural world. So what I'm basically saying is I'm kind of reconnecting us in an urban landscape with this other landscape that we also need to be paying attention to. That this one is where animals and fish and megafauna and plant life are abundant, and what we're doing, we should be aware. And so therefore, just again, we don't get a chance to go to those places. And not a lot of people are going to fly over the oil sands, or not a lot of people are going to go and fly over a mine or visit a mine or a quarry. So in a way, through the camera, and I'm also careful to point out that I don't use Photoshop as a compositional tool. Everything I photograph is a place where I can take you to and show you and say, yes, this does exist in the world. Of course, I'm being very selective in the frame and I'm controlling the gaze, but at the same time, these are all places in the world, even though they look surreal.
But this is your gaze. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the gaze of the person looking at it and drawing the connection between their buying a luxury piece of fashion, a car, some other thing, and the fact that the raw materials for their pleasure came from this scar on the planet on the other side of the world.
But I think in many ways, I see the work as like revelatory and not accusatory. And so I'm trying to pull the curtain back on where those worlds are. So I think that, and like anything like music or art, the completion of the meaning happens in everyone's mind and it's slightly different. So I can't control, and some people might see the piece as, it's interesting because I think the piece can sit in a corporate wall. It can also sit on the wall of an environmental group as well. It can be used in either one of these formats. So I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to pin a meaning on it saying this is bad or this is good. I'm saying this exists. I'm photographing in a particular way to allow people to have access into these worlds, but I'm not editorializing. I'm not saying you need to see this as a negative thing. We need energy. I got here on energy, on a jet. And if it wasn't there, I wouldn't be here. So I understand that we're all implicated in this. So it's a question of we all need to see that we all live on this planet. And if we have children, we want them to have a place to live on this planet in 50 years and 100 years, and their children to have a place on this planet. So they are going to be looking at what we're doing right now. In this decade, it's going to be the most important decade for our kids talking to us in 30 years and saying, what did you do during that time? You knew what was coming. What did you do? So this is our moment to do it.
Right, and to capture that. Well, let's talk, I just came back from Hawaii, and little story is there was a lot of stuff about plastic waste in the ocean there and signs everywhere. And I got to myself to thinking, do you think the plastic waste in the world is really coming from Hawaii? I think it's mostly coming from Southeast Asia. And, we tend to, in the developed countries, spend all our time trying to fix the problems within our borders and think that we were made a solution. Greenhouse gas emissions might be a good one, right? We're very focused on reducing our own, but meanwhile, they're growing in places like Asia. So a lot of your pictures, or some of your pictures, really focus on giving us a perspective of some of the scars on the planet that are happening in the developing countries. Why are you taking those photos, trying to create more recognition to people in the West to think a little broader than just inside their own country?
To look at globalism and industry and how we're reshaping the planet, in a way I felt I had to go to China. And originally I got interested in going to China to see the largest dam being built. So this is in 2001, 2002, the Three Gorges Dam, which still exists as the biggest dam. I don't think any dam will ever be built that'll be bigger than that dam. And so I started there, and then I started seeing all the recycling and the e-waste and the industry and the big factories. And all of that became a really interesting thing to see. And of course, China, now they think it's 1.5 billion people, a province of 35 million, which is the population of Canada, in China doesn't even get a seat at the table in Beijing, just to give a sense of scale. So when you start looking at Southeast Asia with 2.5 billion people between India and China and Indonesia, you start realizing that if we want to understand what's happening to the planet and what we need to do, we need to understand what's happening over there as well. I mean, if you look at the global energy footprint, I think China's now 25%, the United States is 12%. I think we're like 2% or just under 2%.
Of greenhouse gas emissions.
Of greenhouse gas emissions, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to sort of follow up on this a little bit about, exposing through the lens what's going on the other side of the world, and taking into account what you said a little bit earlier, that everybody has a different perspective on art and how they come at it, including photography. I have to tell you sort of my perspective in looking at some of the photographs on the other side of the world stem from, if it's not in my backyard, it's not my problem. Sort of the Western kind of attitude. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that? Is there a sense of that in your work? Like, look what's going on the other side of the world, wake up, because, and I know you said you're not accusatory, but honestly, I think for me, there was that implication there. It's like, wake up. If it's not in your backyard, it is your problem. Oh, sorry. That's right.
Well, it is, because quite frankly, if you look at what, all of the projects, the coal energy projects, power plants that are planned between India and China, if those come to fruition, and now Africa, this is not going to work. It's just no matter what we do, it's not going to work. So we need to pay attention there. I often said that being there, and said we from the West actually need to help them fund alternatives to building those plants, because each one of those coal-burning plants, and that's what they burn, is coal. They're not even burning natural gas, because it's cheap and plentiful in a lot of places in China, and a lot of it's coming from Australia. So that what keeps me up at night is those plants being built, and they all have a 50-year lifespan, and they're not going to want to tear them down. And so in many ways, we need to pay attention there. Although, I can't say that our current relationship with China right now is doing very well, whether Canada or United States. But I think we have to get back to the table. And they still are the largest producers of green technologies, and they still produce more solar panels than anybody else in the world. But even with that, the amount of new energy coming on board, we're still not being able to flatten the curve, let alone start bending it down. So we're still on an upward trajectory for CO2 emissions per year.
Right, I totally agree with you. I mean, we're very busy managing our own emissions, but just even more important is stopping the growth of coal-fired power generation in other places. Well, I want to show you this picture. You already know it, but show our audience this picture. This was a picture taken in Nigeria, and it's some of the oil pollution. Now, you took pictures of the oil sands I think, first in 2007. Yep. And in that 2007 to 9 period, the pictures of the oil sands, not only from yourself, but other artists, really got out. And it really, I think, was a big part. There was one of many things that happened that put the oil sands kind of on the map globally, and not in a positive way. When you take pictures like this in the developing countries, does that result in change? Like, do people look at these pictures and are changes made? I would argue in our oil sands from that 2007 to 9 period, a lot has changed. I mean, there's still some pretty not flattering pictures up there, but there's a lot of positive change that's happened since that time. And I'm wondering if that's the same here.
Well, I think so. I mean, there was a movement. Actually, if you look at if you know the history of that picture, that's called oil bunkering. And the locals were taught by the military how to tap into, often it was Shell was the main company that was there, tap into these pressurized pipelines, put a spigot on it, and then fill boats full of, or barrels full of oil or boats full of oil, go over and put them onto boats to go to the ships and tank them away to refineries as stolen oil. And they're stealing a lot of it. Or they were just processing it themselves in makeshift refineries. It's called bunkering. And basically what they do is they start a fire underneath the tank, and the evaporation comes off as steam from the oil, the light sweet crude that they have there. And on the top of the water, it would all float up. The first 2% were gas, second 2% were kerosene, and then 40% of diesel. So about 45% of that refinery they could do and get valuable product. The other 55%, you need a bigger refinery to get the asphalt and the oils and the lubricants and all the other things, the plastics that we get out of oil. They couldn't do anything with it, so they just poured it into the landscape. So that's what you're looking at, is illegal. But at that point, the whole illegal operations were being destroyed. So that is destroyed bunkering operation that the government was trying to do to correct it. That's just the remaining oil still spewing out of that area a year later after they had stopped the illegal bunkering. So it was one of the most horrific contested landscapes. But again, when you have oil extraction in a place where you don't have governance, you get that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we try and do in our podcast, Jackie, is sort of try and connect the dots more clearly, even with numbers, but with guests and things, is the connection between supply and demand, because so often there's a tendency to vilify only the supply side of the equation and forget again about sort of our own personal consumption. And I know sort of on a bit of a rant on this podcast about the consumption side, because I think it's so important, because the solutions to our environmental sustainability challenges lie equally on the demand side as it does on the consumption side.
I would say even more so, really, because without the demand, people would stop producing these products.
No, absolutely. Right? And what I like about Ed's work, it's not just only about the scars on the planet, but it's also some of the photos about industrialization. And for example, this parking lot full of vehicles, which really is a consumer item, as well as the photo on the right, which is the tires. So Ed, can you talk about sort of like photographing closer to consumption versus sort of going out into the wilderness in the far reaches of the continents, photographing the source of the supply of stuff?
Well, yeah, when I did the oil project, and oftentimes when I do my projects, I try to conceptually move across a range of ideas. So when I decided to do a project on oil, it was I think it was the mid-90s, and I was going to do the tailings at Inco. That was in 96. And I remember there was a brand new asphalt road, and it was raining, and I had a plastic rain jacket, and I had a car that had a plasticized steering wheel, and I just put in 2 quarts of oil because my oil was low and just filled up with gas. And I went, everything I'm doing right now is touched by oil, and I'm on this asphalt. I'm going to show people mining because we don't get to see where copper or nickel or anything comes from. But oil that drives even the mining and allows me to get there, I don't know the landscape of that. And I kind of started to think, like, oil is like we don't see it. It's like the blood in our veins. It provides for our life, but you don't want to see the blood on the floor because there's a problem. You don't want to see oil on the ground. It's a problem. So it is almost like veins of energy coming in. And I said, I want to somehow create a project where I pull the curtain back into that world where the oil comes from. That's why I went to the very beginning where in California, where the first gushers came and they're still pumping oil near Bakersfield. I went to all the different areas I could find where we're extracting oil at the source in the landscape. And then I looked at refineries, and then I looked at the culture of oil. I looked at the consequences of oil, tire piles, the cars, the scrap cars, the new cars, all of it. I started to show a kind of a complete life cycle that oil's allowed for. And in the book, and that show I had at the Alberta Art Gallery was that show, and it was really interesting. And it's not like saying Alberta bad, contributing to the problem. I agree. We're all implicated here. We're all on the consumer side of this. And it's a question of how are we making decisions in our own lives? What are we doing? What companies are we buying from? What are those companies doing to help us do the right thing as consumers? These are all major questions that we need to ask if we're going to get to net zero. The scientists are saying we should get to like half of our energy consumption in the next 10 years or 15 years or by 2030.
By 2040 or something.
Yeah, it's like, okay,
well,
we
half
better...
by 2030 and all gone by 2040.
I know,
is the latest guidance.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Well, and first of all, I did encourage people to go to your website. You can look at the oil section on the website and see some of those photos. And I'm appreciative that you included not only the supply side, but also the consumption side, because I think too much our debate around energy is focused on the supply side without sort of recognizing you have to look at the whole chain, the whole pathway. But let's talk a bit more about energy, since this is an energy-focused podcast, and you've impressed me with your knowledge of refining and energy so far. And I would say that following the pathways is going to get more complicated for transportation, because now we're going to move to mining and extracting all sorts of different minerals to support transportation that we haven't before, and we'll get to that. But first, I wanted to talk to you about studies that have been done. There's been numerous universities that have done studies that have linked corruption and authoritative type governments with poor environmental performance. From your traveling in the world, would you say you've seen that in action? Like the more corrupt a country is, the more you're going to see environmental practices that are leaving scars on the earth that are bigger than they could be?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Nigeria being the case in point. I think at one point I was reading a report that Nigeria that delta was producing. Now that delta is the largest delta in all of Africa. It used to have the greatest concentration of megafauna. There is no megafauna left. The forests are almost depleted. And so it's really taken a beating. The people who were there naturally have really been displaced, and there hasn't really been any support. So none of the money's come back to them properly. That's why they're illegally bunkering there. So when you don't have governance and when you don't have oil, is whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Nigeria, many of these countries, you find that the governments don't have to go to the people to create a brain trust, to create value. It's sitting right there. It's easy to skim off the top. And so it is an authoritarian government. It's a very easy thing. I'm Ukrainian, but look at Russia. Russia couldn't be doing kind of what it's doing right now in the world if it wasn't for the oil and gas that's going out of there every day. It's supporting what they're doing right now. So authoritarian governments tend not to pay a lot of attention to the environment.
Mm-hmm. So the photographs that you've taken basically corroborate the spreadsheets and the bar charts and the numbers that come out of these academic studies. But the photographs that have been taken in and around the oil sands, some went into National Geographic, not yours, but yours are of a similar sort of ilk. They're taken circa 2008, 7-8, and they're not flattering, the tail ponds and so on. And as Jackie said, there has been some improvements along the way and more to come. Maybe give us your response to even back then, the oil industry saying, well, wait a minute, like these people have just cherry-picked the worst of the worst images and are not showing all the good work we're doing in reclamation and all that. Where are those photos and why are they not making it into the mainstream media? How do you respond to that?
Reclamation doesn't make a very interesting photograph, number one.
Yeah.
It's just grass is on a flat field. And,
Exactly.
So I've always looked for the kind of, I've allowed whatever I'm photographing to sort of like help me determine where the point of view or where to lock off the gaze. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's visually compelling is what I'm after. And so I'm also looking at color, I'm looking at form and line and texture and light. All of those things are at play. So they are a real consequence. I've done tailings in mining, and there are tailings in the oil sands as well. So it's part of the process. I understand that you can't have a mine, and there's really in mining, there's two types of tailings. There's the dry tailings and the wet tailings. The wet tailings are where they pulverized the rock and gotten the copper or whatever they're getting out of it. And then there's the dry tailings, which are the rocks that don't have enough mineral to go into process, but they still need to put them aside. And they actually create a lot of problems too, because they leach out a lot of minerals and things there as well. So to me, it's like about process, that this is part and parcel of getting oil this way.
Right. Now, you're in Alberta, so we're just giving you a hard time about the oil sands pictures. But, I look at your pictures of Nigeria, and you have other pictures that aren't so flattering of other jurisdictions that extract oil. But it seems like the oil sands pictures, and they're not all yours, they really put oil sands on the map. They resulted in, I would call it, a type of sanction against the industry. There's investors that won't invest in oil sands. And it's not just because of the photos, but I think they were a big part of sort of bringing that to people's consciousness. Do you think that's fair when you've got pictures of places like Nigeria, and I'm sure if we got photos of Russia, there'd be some pretty ugly pictures there in terms of their oil fields. Do you think it's fair that Canada's resource sector has sort of faced, I think, more sanctions than others that maybe also have big environmental impacts?
Well, I think, quite frankly, the challenge with the oil sands is that if you're taking like light sweet crude and pumping it out of the ground, it's a very different process than oil sands. And oil sands is a mining operation. And so it is a lot of displaced surface. It's actually the largest mining surface operation of any mining operation on the planet. So it's disruptive. It really disrupts the surface of the landscape and displaces a lot of the natural forest. I think if you look at environmental groups like Bill McGibbon, I think, or even Al Gore, they've come and they've said, look, the energy footprint of getting oil this way, which is kind of, the oil sands is kind of like an early stage oil. I mean, give it a little bit more compression and another 30 million years, and it'll probably be oil, that you can pump out of the ground with pressure and everything. But this is a kind of an earlier version of oil. So, and that's why they call it synthetic crude. You're having to separate it from the sand. And I think that carbon footprint of actually getting it out of the ground adds a dimension to it that makes it more scary as a source of energy than even conventional light sweet crude.
I agree. Today, it's higher carbon, and I think that is part of, it's not just the pictures of the tailing ponds, it's high carbon. I will say that the industry, hopefully, will come back in 2030, and we'll have a different story to tell around those carbon emissions. But today, they're high, and I think they're going to change.
Mm-hmm. Well, they are changing. And just as a point of correction, I mean, not all of the oil sands is mining. I mean, a substantial fraction is also with SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage. And there's all sorts of improvements coming along there. But I want to sort of get back to this idea that, okay, if we see it and it's in our own backyard, it's terrible, it's evil. But hey, if we shut it down and get it from some other part of the world, it's okay because it's not in my backyard.
Well, I don't agree with that.
No, I know you don't, but there's sort of this psychology, sort of the underlying psychology, don't you think? Like, it's
think
not
so,
my backyard. It's okay, whether it's making, as I said, stuff for wallets, handbags, shoes, or whether it's for putting gasoline in your vehicle. If it, because that's what's sort of happening is the more we shut down or sanction, I'll call it, as Jackie mentioned it, our own industry. But then we have to start in the Western world importing more of our oil from some of the nasty places. But hey, it's not in my backyard, so therefore I'm not going to turn a blind eye to it. And I know I'm being kind of, I don't know what the word is, like sort of not harsh, but But I think there's a reality to that, don't you think?
Well, I mean, I think we're being criticized right now for not getting enough natural gas off of our shores to help Europe right now with what's happening in the, not taking gas from Russia, that everybody has to step up right now, particularly right now with the war effort. And some are arguing that, like the UN are arguing that we're not doing our part. We are a democratic, elected society that works under rules and regulations, and we're in a fair society. So, and we have a lot of oil. So they're saying, that in a way, there's an obligation. When I do end up having conversations about this with people, they're saying it's bad, and I'm going, well, wait a second. You have to be careful what you wish for. If we stop oil tomorrow, it's called anarchy. I mean, if we look at how much we depend on it every day. So what we need to be talking about is transition and rapid transition. And so that, to me, is a useful conversation. Cease and desist is not a useful conversation because it's unrealistic and it's not. So how do we kind of do that, manage that slipstream into a more sustainable way and do it in a just way so that in the boom and bust cycle of oil, it's not great because, it wasn't that long ago there was a bust. And so it's a very hard thing to ride through being dependent on the price of a barrel of oil for your economy. So the sooner you can transition to a more stable system, that's even better for everybody. So you get away from the boom and bust. And it also solves a lot of problems. But we're going to need energy. It's a question of how do we re-engineer our society to both go to electric cars, heat exchange units for our homes and heating, more electrification, all of that, that's the way out.
Well, and Peter and I both are big believers in electric cars. We think that is the technology of the future. And over time, we're going to have less demand for oil, but we're going to switch that for more demand for things like nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, because it still takes a lot of natural resources to drive electric cars as well. And even you talked about electrification, right? Lots of copper, lots more mining. I mean, we're talking about some estimates, 3, 4, 5-fold increase in the amount of equipment and things we'd need for our electricity versus today. Have you thought about doing an exhibit around electrification that would show people some of the upstream impacts of electrification?
Yeah, well, I've already started doing some of that. Like I went and did the lithium mines in Atacama Desert in Chile, one of the highest concentrations of lithium in the world. I am interested in, that's it right there. So I am interested in doing that. I'm researching rare earths and looking at that as a potential mining, and copper. I've already photographed the biggest copper mines in the world. But I do understand that we're not going to go there without mining. We're not going to go there without some kind of extraction. It is the consequence of who we are as a species and technology. And I think all the signs of what we need to do are there. All the technology, we know what we need to do. It's just hard getting there. And there's a lot of entrenched interests to not change things. And we have to be careful that those don't control the narrative here, that we need to make sure that I think everybody's on board and understanding that we need to get here if you care about the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting about the entrenched interests. I mean, we end up swapping potentially one set of entrenched interests for a new set of entrenched interests as we shift from, say, less petroleum-driven vehicles to more electric vehicles, which rely heavily on the lithium, cobalt, nickel. And I want to show you a photo actually here of basically this is a nickel tailing pond, which you photographed in 1996. And whether it's the lithium or the nickel, and by the way, this is Ontario. This isn't the other side of the planet. This is Ontario. And I guess further to Jackie's question about doing a show on this is the broader question of why all these photos about oil and dirty oil and so on have come forth, but we're not seeing, in my opinion, at least, and I follow a lot of stuff on the news, so much about the negative impacts like this photo that you took of tailing ponds related to mining, which is going to have to, by all accounts, I don't know, Jackie, just order of magnitude more if we're going to get into the electrification world.
Yeah, well, Sudbury wasn't very happy about that picture. But also at the same time, in the art world, it's become that diptych, it's part of a diptych, has become one of my most sought after images that I've ever taken in my career. And so from a museum and collector's point of view, it's become iconographic. And, and there is this bold red gesture right through, a dark moody landscape. So as an image, I think it's a fascinating image. In fact, it actually isn't all that toxic. What that is actually rivers of rust. In other words, they took out the nickel, they took out the copper, they took out anything else that was valuable. There's a little bit of silver in there, but they didn't take out the iron ore, because iron ore mines were far more profitable and they could mine at a different rate. So it wasn't valuable to them. It wasn't worth taking out the iron ore. So those are iron ore. Maybe in the future it will be, and we'll be able to mine. They're saying mining tailings will become something of the future when we can extract more things out of those tailings that are already there. The energy to actually pulverize all of that rock to the point where you can extract the minerals is the big energy footprint. Now, if you can go in there and just process it and put it through another process to get the iron out or anything else that we might have missed in the first round, like a lot of cobalt mining that's happening is the Glencore mine in the Congo. It's tailings that they were going for something. They were going for copper, but there was a lot of cobalt, and the cobalt was in the tailings in high concentrations. So it's the artisanal mining where it's literally biblical, where they're going there and filling bags and putting it on their back and walking it out of these tailings ponds, and so they're mining the tailings for cobalt.
Okay.
So I think the future will be mining tailings.
Right. Well, let's hope so. That's a form of recycling. I think there's hopes that even our oil sands tailings ponds would have that opportunity. I just have a follow-up on that. Why do you think that was such a popular image? Just curious.
I think that the powerful gesture, the orange against the black, if you look at the print itself, it's pretty striking. When I shot it, I was shooting with 8x10 camera. So when you actually see the big print, you can literally see the grains of sand in there. The detail is incredible.
Okay.
But and then if you look carefully, in the background there, you look at those trees, and the tailings have been coming up on those birch trees. Actually, you're just looking at the treetops. The whole base, the half of the tree is in tailings, and you're just. So I actually walked around the forest in there, and you're walking on hard packed surface, in the treetop, because the tailings have come up. Like they pour them, they're in through slurry. They pour them in to be able to spread them out, and then it evaporates and creates. So there's about, I think at that time, 80 meters of tailings with 6,000 acres of surface, 70 meters deep. So if you've ever driven by Sudbury along the Trans-Canada Highway, there's a certain point you come along this bank, and it's huge. That's the tailings pond, just on the other side of that bank.
Yeah, and you don't have any context to the size. It looks small here. So this is a quote from one of your works. Now it is becoming clear that humankind, with its population explosion, industry, and technology, has a very short period of time also has become an agent of immense global change. Arguably, we are on the cusp of becoming, if we're not already, the perpetrators of a sixth major extinction event. So talk about the 5 other extinction events and why you're worried about a sixth.
Well, I don't have history in all 5 of them, but one was volcanism, which is, I think, the 4th. The 5th one was a meteor impact 65 million years ago. So off the coast of Florida, they estimate it must have been about a 4-kilometer diameter meteor struck the planet, causing a iridium dust. It was made of iridium, a dust cloud that went into the stratosphere that took, they figured, a decade to come out of the atmosphere, which created that dark decade.
Right, killed the dinosaurs, right?
70% of all life was extinguished. Yeah. So anything that was small mammals got a better advantage after that. Birds were able to survive. Obviously, insects were to survive, but all the big megafauna, dinosaurs and the bigger animals, all couldn't survive. So that was the last big extinction, 65 million years ago. And arguably, we as a species, a singular species, this is the first time out of all of them that now a species is causing the change of the state of the planet. And it's because of the scale of our population, technology, the internal combustion engine, discovery of oil and gas, the pushing back of diversity, farming. By far, farming is our biggest terraforming activity as a species. So if you look at urban is like 1% of arable land, livable land. Farming is like 26%. So farming is by far the largest thing that we've done to push back biodiversity by cutting down forests, filling in wetlands to turn into farms, and urban as well. We tend to build where there are rivers, deltas, where it's good, rich soils. We often build our cities on that kind of land as well. So urban is about 1% of the land. About 25% is not buildable because of mountains and whatever else. But so we are, as a species, we are tipping. We're like, it's now clear that we are the equivalent of a meteor impact.
Mm-hmm. I think we can agree that there's no easy solution to the three-way tension between supplying the earthly resources, our human consumption, and the fact of 8 billion people in this world that are competing for those resources and those goods that they make. So as you see it through your incredible lens, like not necessarily a solution, but what is your call to action?
If you look at all the players, so we have the consumer, all of us. I mean, you know, every individual has choices to make, and we can make those choices by eating less meat or buying an electric car. The things that I can't, you know, I've been trying to electrify my house. I've been on an electric car now for 6 years myself, and I think I'm trying to do what I can with the thinking that if I get to the point, you know, if I can get myself to the point where if everybody did this, what I've been doing, it very quickly becomes a better world. So I'm trying to kind of create a world that is actually something that goes back into an envelope as an individual. The things that I can't control, like flying, I take all my flights and when I take a helicopter and use that to do a shoot, I'm estimating on all the fuel consumptions on all my shoots. And then I go in and I find one of the best golden offset companies. There's one called Less, which is part of Bullfrog Power in Ontario. And they're like a gold standard of an offset. They make sure that there is that amount of tonnage taken out of the atmosphere for your usage. So I do a double on that. So I've tried to take my studio in my life and making all the decisions there. But then I also think corporations, I think they're important, you know, in their ESG, but also for their customers. It's important for companies to make it easier for us as consumers to do the right thing. So, you know, if the only way I can get my vegetables is in a plastic container in a grocery store, until the grocery store finds another way to do that it isn't using plastic, then, you know, we're all stuck to that, you know. So there are ways in which corporations, I think, can make it easier for us, again, as the consumers and product to do it. And then, of course, I think the role of government is to set a level playing field that is such that everybody knows what the rules are and everybody's working towards moving towards that sustainable goal. And I think governments can really, you know, set those level playing fields for everybody to work in, because we are in a capitalist system, and market-driven consumer capitalism is what makes it all work and gives us all jobs. So it's very, I don't see another ism out there that we're going to go run to. Communism didn't work very well. So, you know, we still have to kind of refine capitalism to a point that when you get all of the energy going in the right direction, you can get rapid change.
Yeah. Well, Jackie, I think we're pretty much out of time, which is unfortunate because I'm very much enjoying this conversation. Ed Burtynsky, thank you so much for raising our awareness through your lens.
My pleasure.
And if I may say, as an amateur photographer, your creativity is off the charts and your attention to detail. And speaking of charts, thanks for turning thousands of spreadsheets into singular images from which we can reflect. And thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Well, and it was a very insightful conversation, so thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone, if you want to learn more or see more, to visit the Paul Kuhn Gallery. And we will put a link to the gallery in our show notes. We'll put a link to your website in our show notes so that our listeners can easily find you. And I also want to thank again GBE Energy for hosting this wonderful event. And thank you all for coming. It wouldn't have been the same without a live audience. So thank you very much. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.